Okay, so for this next tutorial, we're going to go over how to create an animated subtraction, or what would be called an animated boolean difference command. I'm going to start with the Maya file that was created from the last tutorial. So I've got this massing down here, and right now it's keyframed to do this animation, and I've got this axon camera set up so that I can preview what that animation sort of looks like. Before we do any editing to this file, what we're going to do is a quick file, save scene as, and create a new file. Because I don't want to screw up this particular animation. I want to make sure I save this before I do any editing. So I'm just going to save this here and call it subtraction animation, and I'll save that. Then the next thing I'm going to do is just delete that camera, because I don't necessarily want that same camera for this animation. I might end up wanting something different depending on what this animation ends up looking like. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of all of the keyframes of this animation, because I don't want any of these objects moving when I do this. You kind of want to sequence it so you have one animation that is just moving objects, and then you'll set yourself up with a new animation for the subtraction animation. And that's because things can get kind of glitchy if you try and do all of this stuff at once. It's certainly possible, and I've explored with that a little bit, but things do sort of glitch sometimes if you're not careful. So the easiest way to avoid that is to just kind of reset all of your objects so that they're no longer keyframed. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take this object and I'm going to pick a couple moments that I think are most interesting to the animation. So one moment I'm going to grab is frame 1. And so I'm going to select everything and do a Control D that duplicates everything. And then without reselecting anything, you'll notice it duplicated all those meshes in our outliner. I'm going to turn on my move tool, and then I'm going to move this off to the side. And because I've duplicated those, they no longer move, so they're kind of locked in to that position. Okay. Then I'm going to pick a couple more, so I might grab, let's see, frame 150 looks a little different. So I'll grab that one there, select everything, Control D, move it out. So I've got that one kind of locked in. And then let's grab the end as well. So I'll select all those and Control D and move that one out as well. That's just a quick way of like extracting still iterations of your animation. So then I can go in and just delete this because I don't need it anymore. And that's why we kind of saved this as a new Maya file, because the previous Maya file will maintain all of that animation information. So now I've got these kind of 3 objects hanging out in here. One thing I am going to do is group these. So you can do Control G, so you'll notice like you have like a ton of meshes in your outliner now. This is how things can get kind of complicated and out of control in your outliner. So I'm just going to select this first massing and do a Control G on my keyboard, and that's going to group all of those massings. I can still select them as individual pieces, but I can come into my outliner and also select them as a group. And you can maximize the group to see each individual mesh in your outliner. Okay, so I'm just going to grab each one of these, Control G and Control G. All right. So I've got these 3 groups. Before we hop into actually subtracting geometry from these, I'm just going to go over real quick what a Boolean difference actually is and what it means to animate a Boolean difference. Just going to kind of space these out real quick. So let's just grab a really simple cube before we start to do anything. So my grid is way over here, so I'm actually just going to take these and just scoot them over. Okay. So I'm going to grab a cube. I'm going to scale that up so it's nice and big. You can see what's going on. All right. And I'm going to duplicate this cube. And then I'm going to pull it out over and up. So I'm going to run through a couple Boolean commands. One thing to know about your Boolean commands, this is really important, is that you don't want to Boolean two objects that have faces directly on top of each other. What I mean by that is if I delete this cube, and let's say I duplicate this, is directly on top of itself. You can't really Boolean these two objects together. If I pull this up and over, okay, this face and this face are right on top of each other. Okay, same with this one and this one. Okay, that also isn't going to Boolean together very well. So what you want to do is just kind of like stagger these a little bit. If you want them to be super close together, you can just like get it really close, but you never want them directly on top of each other. So you kind of want to like look for that in your massing models. Just quickly check to make sure that's not going to be an issue. So I'm going to pull this over. So I've got two cubes that are kind of slightly intersecting. Up under mesh, your first command is your Booleans command, and that's going to open up this little sub menu. So you have union, difference, and intersection, and a little icon is going to try and show you what happens. A Boolean union, if I do mesh Boolean union, is going to union those two objects together, and it's going to carve out the inside. Okay, so if I just delete one of these faces, you can now see that it's actually carved out the inside of that intersection. Okay, I'm going to undo that. If I do a Boolean difference, it's going to subtract one cube from the other. Okay, it's actually going to carve out the shape of that first cube from the shape of the second cube. And the selection order is how you determine which cube gets subtracted from what. So if I select this first and this second, when I do a mesh Boolean difference, it's going to subtract the cube I selected second from the cube I selected first. So just think about it as like, if I want to subtract this from this, this is what I'm going to select first. If I want to subtract this from this, I'm going to select this object first. Okay. A union intersection, okay, is going to give you the area of intersection. Okay, so that's the square where these two objects were intersecting. Okay, so if you were to kind of like draw an edge here, 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 and here, and then reconnect it, that's the space you're going to be left with. So that's sort of your three main Boolean commands. Now, what we're going to do is create an animated Boolean difference. So we're going to take these massings and we're going to use a cube to start to like carve out interior space and sort of break down this massing into different types of interior and exterior space. And the envelope is going to get a lot more complex as we do so, and we're going to try and create a new series of relationships. found within one of these models. So I'm going to just delete this. I'm going to move this over. And we're going to go through kind of a couple different edits before we create our first boolean subtraction. So what we need to do is kind of prepare this model to accept a boolean subtraction. That's going to involve two things. First, it's going to involve boolean unioning together any pieces of geometry that are touching. Okay, then it's going to involve combining the rest of the loose geometry so that it's one selectable object. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go one by one and select pieces of geometry that are touching and Boolean union them together. So I'm just going to grab this one and this, go to Mesh, Boolean Union, select my next one. I'm going to hit G on my keyboard to repeat that command. And I'm just going to kind of keep going through. So I've got this one, this kind of piece of geometry intersects this face. So I'm going to union those together. Okay. And then looks like this intersects this piece of geometry. So they actually touch there and there. So I'm going to union those together. And then same with this one here. These actually touch. So I'm going to union those together. Oh, and it gave me a error. So let's undo that. And let's see what would be causing that. I'm not really sure. So if geometry disappears like that, undo it. For whatever reason, Maya doesn't like that union. It could be because two faces aren't quite touching perfectly, or there's some like weird little overlap. What I'm actually going to do, just to make this a little cleaner, is I'm going to take this face and I'm just going to kind of push it up a little bit. And then I'm going to come into here. Let's see what's going on here. So those two objects are kind of intersecting each other. So let's see what happens if we union this now. Yeah, there we go. So that little face, for whatever reason, was giving us some issues. But it looks like pulling that up just a hair helped it. So you might have to modify your geometry just a little bit to kind of get things to fit together nicely. And again, if it doesn't quite union together, it's not a big deal if you can't get it. There's a second command that we'll use to kind of group things that are not touching. So you'll notice like none of these objects are touching each other, so you can't actually union them together, but we still want to merge everything so it's one selectable object. Same with this guy here. So what I'm going to do is, now that this is all unioned together, I'm going to select these, come up to Mesh, and do the next menu option down, which is Combine, and click that. Now that's going to combine all of this into one selectable piece of geometry. Okay. Now, why do one instead of the other for a Boolean union versus a combine? Boolean union resolves the intersection between two pieces of geometry, meaning it actually carves out the middle where two faces are intersecting. A mesh combine will not do that. It's going to leave the two objects as being intersecting together, and you want to try and avoid that at all costs, which is why when you're prepping this model for this animation, you want to Boolean union together objects that are actually touching or intersecting, and then any loose objects you can just bring in as a mesh combine and then bring your whole object together like that. So it's just sort of a two-step process. Boolean union objects that are touching, combine objects that are not. Okay. So what that's going to allow us to do is subtract this cube from this piece of geometry, or at least it should. Again, this can get a little glitchy, so you kind of just have to be a little careful with it. So I'm just going to kind of intersect these two objects together. Okay. The other thing I'm going to do, we applied an ambient occlusion material to this object before we rendered it in the last tutorial. So I'm just going to select this, hold down right click, and assign under existing material just our standard Lambert one. Okay, I'll get into why materials matter in a little bit, but right now I just want both of these objects to have the same material, and by default that should be our Lambert one. Okay, so I've got the same material on both of these objects. Before I run my boolean difference command, I do want to clean up my outliner a little bit. This is going to be kind of important. So this got a little messy while I was doing all of those boolean difference commands and boolean union commands over here on those two cubes. And Maya likes to retain as much of that information as you can, so it kind of built up a bunch of stuff over here, which we really don't need. What I want to get rid of is, so I've got one group, our second group, and our third group, and then I've got this p cube 2 over here. Okay, these meshes don't really exist anymore. I don't want them, so I'm going to end up deleting those. And you'll also notice that nothing selects or nothing highlights when we pick group 1. That's because when we combined this massing into a single selectable object, it automatically converted it to this mesh 36. Okay, because that's now one selectable mesh. So I'm going to delete group 1, and if that happens when you delete a group and it accidentally deletes that object, what you have to do is go to edit, delete by type, not all by type, just by type, and do history. Maya likes to track the entire history of an object, so it was kind of trying to save all of the residual information. So at one time this was a group, and then we combined it and became a mesh 36. Well, Maya likes to retain the fact that it used to be a group, so when I went and deleted that group 1, it deleted the mesh 36. You'll also notice when I do the delete by type, it kind of cleaned up the outliner for me. It got rid of all those groups that no longer existed because I deleted objects and all that kind of stuff, so that's kind of helpful as well. But then I can go in here, delete this group 1, and that object isn't going to go away. So all I should have is group 2 and 3, which are my other two massings. I've got my cube, and I've got this mesh 36, which is my combined massing. So what we'll do is we're going to subtract this cube from this mesh. And I want you guys to kind of pay attention to what happens in your outliner. You also want to try and remember, okay, this is mesh 36, and this is p cube 2, okay? You can ignore groups 2 and 3 right now. We're not dealing with that geometry. So let's subtract this cube from this massing. All right, so what I'm going to do is select the massing first, then hold shift and select the cube. I'll then go up to my mesh boolean difference, and it's going to carve out that cube from our massing model. Okay, now I want you guys to see what our outliner did. Okay, the p cube 2 was converted to a group, and then the mesh 36 was converted to a group, and then it created a new mesh 37, which is our new mesh with that boolean operation applied to it. Okay, now we're going to create that sort of animated subtraction, and in order to do that, what you can do is you can go in, and even though that big cube that we subtracted with disappeared, you can still select it in your outliner, and you can move it around, scale it, and rotate it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to that p cube 2 group. Remember that base cube was called p cube 2, and I'm going to pull down the little group tab, and in that is going to be this transform one operation, or this little transform one piece, and I'm going to select that. You're not going to see anything change, but if I turn on my move tool by hitting W on my keyboard, your move gimbal is actually going to pop up where that cube is supposed to be. And what I can do is click and drag this cube around and change the way that that object is being subtracted. Okay, and I can apply any kind of transformation to this that I want. I can rotate it, and it's going to start to create some interesting angles. And then I can also scale it too, to subtract more or less. Okay, like I can grow the cube and make it subtract more, or I can shrink the cube and make it subtract less. So what we're going to do is create an animation of this cube selecting or subtracting out different parts of our massing. And if you go into your channel box, you can see that all of these values that we typically keyframe to get geometry to move will update as we modify this piece of geometry. So I'm just going to kind of reset some of this. So reset my rotate values. And then I'm going to make my scale values back to 1. Pull this out. And reset my translate values as well. Okay, so that was where the cube first started. And so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of create an animation where this cube is not intersecting our massing at all. So our massing looks whole. And then, maybe the cube comes in and starts to subtract out part of our geometry, right? So it just kind of moves in. And then maybe it pulls out and starts to reveal pieces, or it can pull in and maybe do a slow rotate. So maybe it rotates, like 45 degrees or something like that, pushes in further, and then maybe we animate it scaling down, and then it can push out. Okay. But you kind of want to do like a sequence of events where the cube pushes into the object to start the subtraction, then it deforms or changes in some manner, and then pulls back out of the object. Okay, that's typically how I just set these up to work. Remember, if you ever deselect this, you have to select it in your outliner. Okay, so again, I'm just going to kind of reset these. Back. Select this guy, pull it out. I'm just going to kind of have it sit there, and I'm going to pull this up a little bit too, just so we can see what this thing is going to start to look like. Okay, so let's animate this cube kind of moving through our geometry. So I'm going to scale it down a little bit before I have it start subtracting, because I don't really want it to subtract that much all at once. Okay. Kind of want it to be somewhere right there. So I'm going to set this out here. Now I'm going to do this animation over the course of 10 seconds. Okay, so I'm going to leave my time slider between 1 and 300. I'm going to set my slider back to 1. Always set it at starting position. I'm going to go into my channel box, and I'm going to keyframe those translate, rotate, and scale values while I have this cube, this kind of invisible cube selected. Okay, so now it's keyframed at that starting position. So let's say by frame like 100, I want it to pull into the center of my massing. So I start to see this thing kind of carve away. Okay, and create like a really big opening in the center here. So what I'll do is I'll set the position. So I've set my time, now I'm setting the position. I'll right click and do a key selected. So now in order to preview that, I'll hop back to 1, and you can kind of scrub through that animation and kind of see that subtraction occur. All right, now let's say by frame 200, I want it to rotate. Okay, so I'm going to set my frame at 200, and then I'm going to turn on my rotate tool, and I'm going to rotate this 45 degrees. I'm actually going to come up here and type in 45 and hit enter so I can actually say it rotated exactly 45 degrees. Okay, and then I'll select all of this, key selected. All right, and then let's say by frame 300, we're going to have it kind of move out this way to about here before that wall kind of pops up, and then we'll have it kind of move back out this way and then disappear. Okay, so let's set our frame to 300. So that's going to be 2 motions. So I'm actually going to set this to 270 or about 260, and I'm going to push it back to about there, and I'll key all this, and then I'll set it to 300 where it kind of pulls forward and pulls out, and I'll key it there. So now this should be one kind of complete animation where this massing pulls in, rotates, pushes back, and then pulls out. Okay. Now that last clip was a little fast. If you play that again, it's going to kind of pull out real fast. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold shift, I'm going to drag across this key. I'm just going to kind of tug this over a little bit. So it's going to speed up the first part and slow down the second part. So now when I play this, it's going to push back and then pull out. That's a little slower, so I'm okay with that. But really you want things to go probably a little slower than that, but for the sake of this tutorial it'll be okay. So now I've got this animation, right? The next thing I'm going to do is apply our ambient occlusion material. So I'm going to select this, assign existing material or new material if it's a brand new file, but I can go under existing because this ambient occlusion was left over from our previous file. And then I'll release on that, and it's going to make this darker. So we can kind of preview this at a couple different moments so you guys can see what this starts to look like when things begin to intersect. Basically all you're really going to get is this. So if I hit the render button, you're going to start to see that subtraction being taken out of that piece of geometry. And the interesting thing is that you start to develop new relationships between different surfaces, right? So that surface aligns with this, and it actually kind of creates like a relationship between the interior of this object and the different kinds of surfaces of each part and piece and sort of the exterior of the object. So you're kind of breaking down the envelope into a bunch of different pieces that have different kinds of relationships to them. So I'm going to close this. I'm going to set my animation back to 1. And then what I'm going to do is set the camera before I send this rendering out. Typically, for an animation like this, I don't move the camera. It's already complex enough in terms of what's happening to the massing model itself, so it's okay to leave the camera still and let the object that's doing the subtraction kind of do its thing. So I'm going to create a axon camera, so I'll go to my cameras, I'll go to my camera and aim, click the options box, scroll down, make sure orthographic's checked, and click create. It's going to create my camera over here. I've got a new camera group. I'll pull this down, pull this out. I'm going to set the aim to about the center of the geometry, select a camera, kind of pull it over, get it a little bit closer, pull it up, and set it up a little bit, just like it was before on our previous tutorial. Okay, and then what I'll do is tap the space bar, go down to one of our other viewports, and switch it over to that camera. So that's what I'm actually looking at. And again, it's really far zoomed in. So we're going to select the camera and go to its attributes. So I can select it here or pick it in my outliner, go to its attribute editor, and then scroll all the way down under camera shape 1 tab. Go to orthographic views, and we're going to set this to like 80, and that should zoom it out. Okay. Let's turn on our film gate so we can see our video extents. Let's select the camera aim and try and get this thing centered a little bit more. So we'll just kind of set it something like that. All right. I'm going to maximize this viewport just so I can see it a little better and check it. And then what I'll do is I'm going to render this out a couple times just to make sure everything looks okay. So that looks pretty good. Hit escape to exit out. And then our animation is going to be something like this. Okay. Now I'll render it at this moment here just so I can see what that looks like. All right. I don't really need to render it one more time. I know the end is going to look the same as the beginning, and all of that should look okay as well. All right. So we've got all this set, and then what you can do is go back to the first tutorial if you need to and render out this animation using the script editor. Pull it into After Effects and create the video. A couple of things I'm going to show you guys in addition to this sort of typical subtraction animation is how to create a subtraction animation where the faces that are being subtracted are a different color than the massing itself. So it kind of gives a different sort of effect to it. And it makes the subtraction a little bit more obvious. So let's kind of run through and I'll show you guys what that looks like. And we can do that to this second massing model. So I'm just going to kind of clean up my outliner a bit. I've got my camera. These belong to that other animation, so we're going to leave that as is. So the first step, again, we need to boolean union all of our touching pieces of geometry. So we'll select, and in this case it's like most of it just because everything has started to shift and move around at this point. So we'll select this, and do a mesh boolean union. Select the next one, hit G to repeat command. All of this is now intersecting, so we can do that. And again, when pieces start to disappear like this, just have to kind of check it and see where the geometry might be getting messed up. Sometimes the easiest thing to do is just to select that piece of geometry and just kind of move it a little bit. Mesh boolean union. I didn't quite do it yet. Let's see, what if we move it down some? Mesh boolean union. There we go, that worked. So you might have to just kind of slightly adjust certain objects to get it to union together well. And chances are that's because one face of one piece of geometry was directly on top of a face of a different piece of geometry. If you go back to the beginning of the tutorial, I mentioned that you really need to look out for that. And so slightly adjusting pieces of geometry will help resolve some of those issues. So I'm going to go through, select the next piece of geometry, mesh boolean union. Then we'll grab this guy, hit G. Let's grab one of the posts, grab the second post. Looks like that guy and that one are loose. They're sort of floating, so we're not going to grab those. And then this plane over here is floating as well. So what we'll do for the rest of this is select it and do our mesh combine. Okay, so it's all one big object now. And then you'll notice over here this ended as mesh 43. So just kind of keep that in mind. And then we'll create a new cube. Scale it up a little bit and intersect this object. Okay. Now, the difference between this and the first Boolean difference I did is we're actually going to change the color of this object. Okay. This we're going to leave as our ambient occlusion material. So I'm going to right click, assign existing material, ambient occlusion, just to make sure. It should be that kind of grayish color. And then for this cube, what we're going to do is I'm going to select it, assign new material, go to shader under Arnold, and give it a different ambient occlusion. Okay, so even though it's the same material, it's going to have two different names. You'll notice this one is, when you select it, AI ambient occlusion 2. This is going to be AI ambient occlusion 1. Okay, which means I can edit the material on this object without changing this one. So I'm going to select this, go into my attribute editor, and select the final tab, which is our material. And under the white, we're going to change this to like a yellow or a red. Let's see what that looks like when we render it. Okay, so now that cube has like a red shade to it. All right. And then what we're going to do is we'll do the, now that this has a different color on it, we're going to do our Boolean difference. So I'll select this object, select this one, do a mesh Boolean difference. It's going to carve that object away. Now when I render this, what you'll notice is that where the cube actually subtracted geometry, those faces are now taking the color of that original cube. Okay, so it's a much more diagrammatic effect. I think it's a lot more interesting to do it this way because you start to see relationships or new relationships that you're starting to bring forth with that piece of geometry. Okay, typically what I'll do, I'm just going to kind of undo that Boolean difference. I'll usually set this to black. So if we take this color, make it black, and then render it, that cube should look black. Yep. All right, it's not actually subtracting, it's just black and intersecting our material. What I'm going to do is, if I have this cube as black now, I'm just going to kind of move it up, and I do the Boolean difference. Okay, when I go to render this, what you'll notice is that it's going to actually look like I'm taking a section through the model. Okay, that black sort of renders out as like a poche. Okay, almost as if this piece of material has thickness to it and I'm really carving into it. I think black looks a little bit nicer, but if you guys want to mess around with colors, that works too. But this is just sort of a different way to produce a Boolean subtraction effect where it looks like you're taking a section out of the model. And this is how we create like more complex section cuts that are not just planar cuts, but sort of section cuts from multiple directions, where you almost take a section through as a section, and then you can take it simultaneously as a plan as well. So you get kind of interesting effects that way. And so again, what you can do is under your P cube 3, which is that cube that we created here, select the transform tool, and you can start to animate this as well, right? So I can keyframe it out here at frame 1, just before it starts to touch that cube. I'll go into my channel box, frame 1, select it all, key selected, and then we can start to animate this thing. So I'll kind of push it inwards, push it outwards. One thing you're going to notice, possibly depending on how this cube is cutting through, kind of watch this little piece of geometry down here. See how it glitches like that? Okay. You kind of want to watch for that stuff. When this geometry starts to get complex like this, and there's a lot of parts that are kind of merging together, and then you're kind of cutting into things like that, those types of things can happen. They render a little weird. So while you're creating your animation, you want to kind of watch out for things like that, right? And you'll notice that as I push this inward, I'm getting this little error, cannot perform boolean operation. That isn't good either. So again, like, you're going to be kind of limited as to how far you can kind of push and pull this cube around. Now that's probably occurring right when it gets to, let's see what happens. Oh, see, so now it's actually letting me pull it all the way through, probably because I shifted it down a little bit or something like that. So there's going to be moments where this thing starts to disappear. And you kind of just want to make sure that as you're keyframing this object, that isn't happening, right? So I've keyframed it at frame 1, right? And then let's say by frame 100, I'm going to push this in to about there. Okay, and as I did that, it didn't really look like the cube disappeared at all. I'm going to have a little bit of glitching down there from that, so I'm actually going to pull this up somewhat as well, so that glitching doesn't really occur, and I'll key it there. So now that animation, it's going to look something like this. Okay, and then let's say by frame 200, I'm going to rotate the object. And again, I'm going to rotate it exactly 45. And I'll key these. And then let's say by frame 300, I want this to kind of push downwards along the angle that it's rotated. So I'm going to select my tool options, change the axis orientation to object, close that, and that's going to allow me to pull this down this way. Now you see that disappeared. So I don't want to pull it all the way down. I'm just going to pull it to there. And then I'm also going to scale it at the same time. I'll bring it inwards a little bit, because if I scale it up, it's going to start to disappear. So we'll do something like that. Okay, now I'm actually going to have that done by, let's say, instead of frame 300, I'm going to do that by frame 230. Okay, just because I can't go very far with it. So we'll pull it down to about there and key that. Okay, then what I'm going to do is have it rotate again by frame 300. And I'll have it rotate. So I can't go too far, it's going to start to disappear on me. So I'll rotate it to about something like that, where it's just a little off. And then I'm going to see if I can scale this up at all. I can go a little bit. It's really not that big of a deal if it disappears. If you really start to get an effect that you like, just let it disappear and it sort of is what it is. So I'm going to scale that all the way up there, like that, because I kind of like the way that looks. So I'll select these, right click, key selected. And now that animation is going to look something like this. Oops. Where it kind of pushes in, pulls up a little bit, it'll rotate, push inward, and then start to scale up. Now you might get lucky and it might actually end up being okay, but we'll see how that kind of turns out when we go to render it. And then the last thing we're going to do is sort of set our camera. So I'm going to come up to Create, Camera, Camera and Aim, go in the Options box, make sure that Orthographic View is selected, click Create. And that's going to create our second orthographic camera. And again, it's just about kind of placing it at the right location. So I'll set my aim, kind of pull that over, and then pull this over and up. It's about matches that one as well. You can back it up to make it a little easier. And then I'll go back to our 4 viewport tab, take one of our viewports under panels, go to orthographic, and this is going to be camera 2. So I'll set that, and again we have to zoom out. So we'll go into our camera attributes under our attribute editor, go in the camera shape 2, and set this to a higher number so that it zooms out. Turn on our film gate, pan around, select our aim, and kind of center this object. Now it's a little bigger, so I might zoom out a little bit more than what I've done. So I'll select that camera again. Under its attributes, let's set this to like 100. That looks a little better, a little bit more breathing room. So I'll pull this up and down a little bit. Okay, and then we can preview our animation. Now I know before the object was glitching a lot when it was doing this, and now it's not. This is a very glitchy technique, so you guys are just going to kind of have to work through it. Move the cube around in such a fashion that your object doesn't glitch. I know that's going to kind of constrain you to certain movements or certain paths. You might not be able to do exactly what you want. But just kind of work with it and do the best you can. And we'll just kind of have to see, how these things end up turning out. So we're just going to run a quick test render to see what this thing ends up looking like. So we've got like that nice dark poche spot. Looks pretty good. It kind of really defines what's being subtracted out of this piece of geometry. So we can take kind of a couple more renders. We could pick one of the spots where it was glitchy when we were first testing this out, just to kind of see what that's going to look like. Now, that looks okay. There's no guarantee that it's going to render perfectly like that every time. So we'll just kind of have to see how it comes out. And using the render script might give you a different result because that's a different rendering technique. So again, it's just a matter of kind of testing it and reworking it to kind of get it to look good, try and minimize the amount of glitching, all that kind of stuff. And again, feel free to mess around with colors too. It doesn't have to be kind of a black poche. It can be, any kind of different color.